Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give everyone just a minute to join in before we get started. So just hang tight, grab a cup of coffee or your lunch, and we'll get started in just a minute. It looks like people are popping in, so I'm going to get started. I want to give Dr. Schulze as much time as we can today, so I'll get started with our brief intro before I turn it over to him. So good afternoon, everyone, and happy spring break, even though it feels like we're in the middle of winter out here today. I'm Andrea Coronado, Director of Development and Communications at Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's Icebreaker speaker series. I'll be your host for this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Today marks the final event in our 2025 Icebreaker series. This program has been possible thanks to the generosity of our members and donors. Your support keeps these conversations free and accessible to our community, and for that we are truly grateful. For those of you who may be new to the Watershed Council, welcome. We are a membership-based nonprofit organization celebrating 45 years of protecting and caring for the water resources of Northern Michigan. And with the help of many, we work to preserve the lakes, streams, wetlands, and groundwater that make this region so special. Our work is focused locally in the watersheds of Antrim, Charlevoix, Sheboygan, and Emmett counties, but also contributes to the health of the entire Great Lakes Basin. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. If you use that Q&A function, we'll hold those questions to the end. If there is something especially timely, we may jump in and interrupt Peter, but otherwise the questions will be held to the end. And when we return, you'll be hearing from our Executive Director, Heather Hufsteller, who will be moderating our questions with Dr. Schulze. If we run out of time and we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards. You can feel free to contact us directly here as well. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube following this session. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see a short survey pop up. We'd really appreciate your feedback. It helps us to plan for our future programming. So now I'm thrilled to turn it over and introduce today's speaker, Dr. Peter Schulze, Professor of Biology and Environmental Studies at Austin College, who will be spending some time with us today talking about climate change. In addition to his many, many professional titles and accomplishments, Dr. Schulze also has a family cabin here in Northern Michigan and spent much of his time on the lakes and rivers that he loves. We are so excited to have you with us here today. So Dr. Schulze, welcome, and I'll turn off my screen and you can share.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure to get to talk to folks. I've been a big fan of the Tip of the Mitt for a long time, and I consider myself exceedingly lucky that my mother and grandparents lived in Detroit, and my grandmother had apparently hay fever, as they called it, which I suspect was actually respiratory reactions to the air pollutants of the mid and early 20th century, and the cure was to go up north, and lucky for all of the few of us in our family that my grandfather and grandmother, found a little piece of property when it was a 2-day drive from Detroit. And I don't live there, but I'm more connected to that part of the world, really, I think, than anywhere else. And so, and as I say, I've been a fan of the Tip of the Mitt for a long time. My background is in aquatic ecology, and my training, that's not what I'll be talking about today. And it's just a pleasure. And I often use what goes on up in Emmett County as an example to people down around here, whether it's the Conservancy, our properties has an easement on it, or even the waste and recycling facility on I can't think of the name of the road right now.
Pleasant View.
Pleasant View, it's just like a model. So anyway, today I am the title of the talk is that you've seen is Climate Change and Taking Action. And I decided to give it a subtitle of Achieving Sustainability of an Agricultural Society, a long-term project only recently attempted. I teach and among other things, environmental studies to undergraduates, and we give a decent amount of thought to not making them depressed. They haven't seen a lot of big progress in a lot of cases in their lifetime. I don't mean by the tip of the mitt up there in that area. I mean nationally, say. So I get them to try to take a long-term perspective, and we have a big challenge. Climate change is one aspect of it. But what we're really talking about is making society environmentally sustainable in a way that doesn't cause other problems. And there were environmentally sustainable societies, but I don't really think there have been any agricultural societies that were truly environmentally sustainable. So it's a big challenge. But on the other hand, it wasn't even discussed when I was in college. That wasn't an objective yet. And so it's to be expected it will be uh, a long-term project, not something that gets solved by next week or next month. So if I didn't thank Heather and Andrea and Kala for helping me prepare for this, not to mention inviting me, I'll do that now. And they've been helpful in helping me try to guess sort of what to expect in terms of background of the audience members, but of course that'll vary. And so I will be hoping to target correctly about how much background to give, but not give too much background on topics that you're likely already familiar with. And so please do send questions to them if some point that I make in the middle of the talk needs to be clarified. But my plan is to quite quickly review the very most basics of the greenhouse effect and some overall sort of future temperature projections based on that, and then spend most of my time on the next three things on this list, which is trying to help people understand something that I do not understand. I mean, I guess I understand it more or less as well as others, but I can't really grasp, which is how much difference a few degrees of average planetary temperature can make, especially a few degrees of warming, because it's unprecedented. And then we'll talk about specific projections for Michigan regarding air temperatures, precipitation, and lake levels. And then the talk title announced was Climate Change and Taking Action, and we'll talk a little bit about things you can do. And I'm going to assume you know about certain things, and I've made some guesses, so to speak, about things that may be a little more mysterious or curious or seem questionable. Not ethically questionable, but how they work. And I'll say a few things about societal transformation. Just a couple thoughts. So I hope that sounds okay. So people would be less confused, I think, if the greenhouse effect was called the parked car effect, at least many people, because most of us don't spend any time in greenhouses, but we've gotten into a parked car. In fact, don't ask me to explain this, but I live in North Texas, and I looked at the forecast before I parked this morning and it said 88 degrees today, and my car is parked with the windows open. It's parked a little bit, and it's parked with the windows open to avoid it getting very hot due to the greenhouse effect. So what happens to a car parked in the sun is exactly the same thing in physics principles that goes on with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The light enters through the windows, visible light. That's, as I tell students, that's why we use glass for windows, because we can see through it. Visible light goes through it. And a little bit of that light bounces back out still as visible light, but only a small fraction. Thus, the car looks dark on the inside, especially in this image where it's got black interior. But any car is going to look a lot darker on the inside than if you looked up toward the sun. Very little of the light has bounced back out. Most of it's been absorbed. And when it's absorbed by opaque objects, that light energy is converted into energy of vibration of molecules, and it warms those objects up. And objects that have any temperature above what's called 0 Kelvin emit infrared radiation, which is like visible light, but we can't see it. But infrared radiation doesn't pass through glass the way visible light does, and it doesn't pass through greenhouse gases in the atmosphere the way visible light does. And so that causes the infrared radiation to reflect back from the glass, bounce around inside the car, and get absorbed by the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere inside the car, and the car gets very, very hot. That's the greenhouse effect. And that leads, because greenhouse gases are building up in the atmosphere, that leads to projection, both a history of some warming on the planet already and projections of further warming. And here are projections And I've sent, I think Calla or Andreas, one of you all is going to put some links in case people are interested in looking at these sources in the chat, so you can see what the links to much of the data that I'll show you. I'm not going to show you a ton of data, but to some key links. And so what you see here is the orange line is actual records of temperatures since 1900 for the state. The gray fog here sort of is if the people that make the future projection models, one of the ways that they try to ground truth their models is they run them back in time, and they run them and they say and they see if it matches the actual track record. And the models, they run the models thousands of times because they have some random factors in there that they want to incorporate. And this gray shade is the range of which the model projections caused if you run them back in time. And you see that's a pretty good match to the actual record. Doesn't mean they can predict the future. We don't usually think people are sane if they say they can predict the future, but they're obviously trying to predict the future. And so then we have two ranges of future projections here. This one lower, assuming lower greenhouse gas emissions, and this one assuming higher greenhouse gas emissions. And so it remains to be seen what's true, but these are the projections, and they show projections of this is a little freaky, but it gets up into 10 degrees Fahrenheit if you get up in here compared to the background. By the way, the different slides are from various sources, and sometimes they'll refer to RCP 8.5 or business as usual. These things also mean the higher emissions scenario. Business as usual means if greenhouse gases just continue on their past trends and people don't effectively reduce their emissions compared to those trends. But it's not, since you woke up this morning, it may very well be more than 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was. I mean, it may be 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer now than it was when you woke up. And so we're used to a high degree of fluctuation, not only daily, but certainly even more seasonally in air temperature. And so I find it hard to understand why care about a few degrees. So here's a projection from one of the websites that the link to the source will be. It's from U of M through a NOAA program. It'll be in the chat, and it shows the projections for around here from for this period of time compared to this period of time. The projections for the high emission scenario is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And like, who cares about 4 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, it's very hard to comprehend the consequence of that. In fact, there's a book, a very good book. It's getting old. It's 30 or so years old now, but it's still a very good book by a man named Bill McKibben named End of Nature. And he quotes in there an old EPA document that says, part of our limitations for our trying to anticipate the consequences is the limits to our imaginations. And the way I'm going to try to help, the way I try to understand this or try to grasp how hard this is to understand is to think about what things were like in the past when the average temperature of the planet was a little bit different. And so living where I presume most people on this call live somewhere in the vicinity of the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. And so you almost surely are aware that that area was covered by glaciers. And in fact, in geological history, not affected by human air emissions, we'd be considered to be living in an interglacial period now. And ice cover is the more typical situation. Well, here's the Laurentian ice sheet at the last glacial period, and here's a temperature record. And I'm going to try to change a little bit what I see because now I can see my whole slide. Okay, here's a temperature record for the planet. This is the planet average temperature for the last 450 or so thousand years, and you see here we are now. And here's a glacial period, here's a warm period in the past, here's a glacial period, here's a warm period in the past, etc. Well, if we go back, got an issue going on with my cursor. There we go. If we go back to 12,000 years ago, the planet was about 4 degrees Celsius. Apologize that some of the slides are going to use Celsius and some Fahrenheit. And you're probably aware that a Celsius degree is about 2 Fahrenheit degrees. So this is about 8 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than present. When that was the case, this was the ice sheet. And if we look closely at this is looking at, bird's eye view from way above Hudson Bay, sort of, if you grasp your bearings there. If we look real closely, we'll see there's a little 2 here that corresponds to this contour line. And here we go, and right through Little Traverse Bay. And what is that 2? That's 2,000 meters of ice thickness. So when the planet was 4 degrees colder, the ice where the tip of the Mitt office is was over a mile thick, according to the geologists. 4 degrees colder, ice over a mile thick. Now, it'd been cold for a while, right? That ice had time to build up. But the point is, that's a very different circumstance. And if we go back in time, what about 4 degrees warmer? Well, there are times in the past, like during the age of the dinosaurs, when the planet was 4 degrees warmer. But if we go back, this graph now shows 5 million years. And so I teach intro bio, and people think based on the paleontological evidence that the first creatures that the anthropologists call Homo sapiens occurred about then, and some things that we wouldn't be able to tell the difference with lived through here. Some of our ancestors. You got to go back to, if you've heard of a skeleton called Lucy. Lucy was an Australopithecus, lived in Africa about 4.5 million years ago. And you go all the way back to Lucy, and it's only 1 degree Celsius warmer than now. So there is no human or even close to human history of anybody living in a warmer climate than what we're talking about now. This is the end of the Pleistocene glaciation. These are glacial periods. Those caused some significant disruption, but we don't know. None of us have been there. And so literally, I mean, last year in Fort Worth, some railroad tracks were buckling just because of a period of hot weather. We can't imagine the number of possible consequences. That graph I showed before was average temperature for the year. I'm going to show you a few graphs, and the link to these should be in the chat, or at the end of the talk will be in the chat. This is average summer temperature by mid-century. Again, if greenhouse gases just carry on in the trajectory they've been on, and that's about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's still hard to relate to, but I can say that when I was a kid, my family never lived in Michigan year round, but we would usually travel. We always, when I was a kid, travel there in the summer, and usually be there in sort of late July, early August, maybe later August. And we would often the cabin we have is just an old log cabin, and we would build a fire in the fireplace often in the evening. And I can't remember a time in the last couple decades when we built a fire in the fireplace ever, because it just was already warm in the evening. This is a diagram showing the length of the frost-free season. And this is showing projecting roughly 40 degrees more than a month frost-free. And that has a lot of consequences. You can start growing tomatoes earlier, and you might have tomatoes growing for longer. If you want to go skiing at, one of the local ski areas, you're not going to have as much opportunity to do that. But this is just another way of portraying one of the kinds of effects of some overall average annual temperature change, drilling down a little bit more to details, kind of. This has some consequences for whether the conditions are dry or moist. Here's the number of degrees over 100, and I can't remember being up there when there's a degree over a day over 100. And this is predicting a few days a year over 100. My father was from Springfield, Illinois, though. That's ugly. I mean, I'm sure they've got quite a few days over 100 in Springfield, Illinois already, but another 25. That's not very pleasant. So that's another way of looking at some projections. I'm trying to give a sense that just thinking about the average annual temperature for the year is kind of hard to relate to, but hopefully these things are a little easier to relate to. Precipitation is harder. I'm not a climate modeler. I have a friend that is, but precipitation is harder to project than just air temperature change, because precipitation is affected by air temperature change. So and it's affected in complex ways. So whatever affects air temperature change, it involves some uncertainty. And then that uncertainty then gets added into the uncertainty about precipitation changes. but frankly, part of the problem is the uncertainty. Is you can't. It's harder to plan for uncertain circumstances than certain circumstances. And here's a figure from USDA website showing their estimates from a model about precipitation. And if you look at the website, it'll show for all the seasons, but it would look small, so I just chose to blow up summer, and summer is when the effect looked the strongest too. I'm not trying to show worst case scenarios. This, could have real consequences to me. I can imagine as an ecologist, they're projecting with high emissions, there could be several inches less of rain during the June to August period. And I do a lab here where my students measure tree growth rates from some tree sections I have from Michigan and from Texas, and the trees grow much faster down here. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. Part of it, I think, is the sandy soil up there. It is not terribly fertile. It's not a bad thing. It's not that simple. It's just that the soil is sandy and the growing season is shorter, and the sandy soil dries out and just because it drains so well, and a few degrees difference in rainfall in the summer could make for some stress on some plants. That USDA website anticipates that shorter winters and combined with longer growing seasons and warmer summers would lead to more summer and fall moisture stress. That's even without a reduction in rainfall. Likely increase in fires, more severe insect and pests and pathogens of trees if the trees are stressed, and northern species losing suitable habitat. So again, the effect isn't only how hot it is outside. What about lake levels? These are my grandparents, and I think this was probably taken around 1960 or so, during a period when the lake was pretty low. Lake levels may be even harder to project because it's affected by all the things we've been talking about so far. And also it varies historically, as you're probably aware. Here's the record for Lake Michigan and Huron since the detailed records were started being kept in just before 1920. And as I suspect you're aware, the lake varies, and from one extreme to the other, goes about 2 meters. So this is 177.5 meters above sea level, and this is, sorry, I can't read, 175.5 meters above sea level, 177.5 meters above sea level. So 2 meters, so that's a little more than 6 feet, but the range doesn't quite go from that bar to that bar. So the lake naturally varies it's not exactly a sine wave here, but over a decade or two cycle from one peak to another or one trough to another. Troughs aren't all the same, of about 2 meters. Group and it matters, right? I mean, when the lake is up here and there's a storm, people in Harbor Springs get a little bit, it has consequences. By the way, there's something on this graph that's a little hard to interpret if you notice it and I don't point it out. The graph for going forward shows the 6-month forecast, upper limit and lower limit. The way this is, I've got it displayed, it's like you can really only see the upper limit. So the modelers are not saying the lake is going to shoot up like this in the next 6 months. The lower limit just goes blip like right there. And so they're saying it's somewhere between here and here in the next 6 months. There's a group at Michigan Tech that does lake level modeling, and this is even more complicated than modeling the precipitation because they've got to model the climate change or get the climate change model, then add in the precipitation model, then figure out things like evaporation, how fast the lakes drain, the river, where the precipitation falls, does it fall within the watershed, and that sort of thing. And their models suggest they expect, if again on the business as usual scenario of emissions, that Lake Michigan's kind of average set point would go up by about 40 centimeters, which is about a little over a foot. But this is not their high emission scenario. This is their model. When they run, it doesn't come out exactly the same every time. That's the nature of these models, and because they have interacting factors in them, which lead to some complexity in the predictions. Could be 80 centimeters. 80 centimeters would move this historical average up to here. I have lived such a charmed existence that my only recurring nightmare is the lake comes up, erodes the bluff and cabin, which was built closer than the lake than what my grandfather asked them to do. It's not right on the bluff like some places, but it's, falls into the lake. And if that happens, that's the least of the problems associated with the lake coming up that much. So here's hoping none of this stuff is correct and it won't happen. But this is the most sophisticated predictions so to date. So I forgot to start my watch. How are we doing on time?
You're pretty good. We've got about half an hour left.
Okay, very good.
And
Did you get any,
you're scaring me a lot.
well, hey, I don't mean to be scaring you. Um, we can't deal with the situation until we get it and or get it as well as we can. Have
And
you
just so
received
you
any
know,
questions? Pardon me?
I don't have any questions to catch up on in the meantime, but we are posting the links you're mentioning in the chat, so guests are able
Excellent.
to
Okay,
see
very
them.
good. So I've made some choices here. I can't stand it when speakers go long, and so I've leaned toward trying to be under time and have time for questions if people have questions. Otherwise, people have more time in their day, one way or the other. So I'm not going to try to give any kind of comprehensive discussion of these topics. Just a few things that I thought might be of interest. And the last one is to try to scare you less. Okay. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what you can do if you're interested in reducing your own greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd be stunned if this is the first time that most people listening to this presentation have ever thought about that. So I won't start from scratch there. I'll say a couple things about who knows whether I'm right or not, but one way you might try to help other people understand what we're talking about. And I'll say a couple things about what I like to imagine, so to speak, with regard to what could happen in the future. Um, so you may have heard people refer to your ecological footprint or your environmental footprint or your greenhouse gas footprint. Those are not quite synonyms because greenhouse gas is only one part of your ecological footprint, but you're probably aware that if you want to reduce those things, one thing you can do is conserve the amount of greenhouse gas emitting energy that you use by doing these types of things. And I wasn't planning to talk about any of those. If somebody has questions, we can talk about them. But what about the emissions that you can't avoid by conserving resources? In other words, you're driving to work, your car uses gasoline, you can't work remotely all the time. You can't avoid burning no gas. Or in my case, I tell my students I'm going environmental hell because I know about these things. My wife and I have a grandchild that lives in Colorado. We live in Texas. You might imagine we like to visit. We get along quite well with our sons too, and we're nuts about them. And we drive to Colorado, and I have a little electric car and a hybrid electric car, but it doesn't you can't get to Colorado with that without burning several tanks of gas. So what about those? What can you do? And there are two basic options. And the first one, it applies only to the electricity that you burn that may not be generated without generating fossil fuels, or I mean, generating greenhouse gases. And then the other has to do with the other types of fossil greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do to essentially eliminate or make trivial amount the greenhouse gas generation that's due to your electricity consumption. And we'll talk about something called renewable energy certificates and also about basically installing solar or wind power, that kind of thing. And then I want to talk about a little bit about, or I plan to talk about emissions that don't come from electricity, such as you drove a car a long way and burned a lot of gas, and is there any way to compensate for that? And that will get us into a topic that, for which, in my experience, there's a great deal of confusion and skepticism, but I think it's an unavoidable part of the solution, the topic of carbon offsets. So, but we'll take these in order. So one option for renewable electricity, and I only learned this yesterday, our cabin doesn't use a lot of electricity because it's mostly empty. But we're on Great Lakes Energy up there, which I imagine many of you are, because down here we have deregulated electricity and it's a piece of cake to get wind power and stuff like that. But and there's pros and cons to deregulated electricity. But up there, I don't believe you have any choice about your source of energy, and that's okay. There's a reason for that. They actually have an option where you can buy into a community solar project. And I want to make clear, I'm not a consultant for designing renewable energy projects, and I don't have any financial stake in anything I'm talking about. I mean, I have a stake in the world turning out okay, but not, if I mention a company or a utility or something, I don't have any conflict of interest. But they have a system where you can pay, you're essentially paying for them to put solar panels in a solar field that they have that's down Highway 75 a ways. I forget it says on the website the location. Maybe some of you know it. And then you can pay for it up front, or you can pay for it in installments. I noticed you pay for it in installments. They're not charging interest. It's the same total amount as paying up front. And then you get credit for the electricity generated on your bill. So that's the finances of it. But what you're effectively doing is you're causing solar power generated electricity to go into the grid. And if you do that to the degree that you use electricity, then you're putting just as much in as you're taking out. And so the way you can think of it, and it's a legitimate way to think of it, I think, is your electricity didn't cause greenhouse gas emissions because you made as much come in from solar panels. I understand that you have to use some greenhouse gases to make a solar panel, but you came in from solar panels and then you drew it out. And I won't call myself any kind of expert on that option yet, but I did, make a few calculations yesterday, and I have a solar system on our house, and this option is less expensive than putting in your own. You don't need to have all the parts of your own thing that way. You're adding to I suppose it's economy of scale sort of thing. So there's that option. There's some complexity there. Again, I'm not an expert on the pros and cons, but I do have a solar system, and for a long time, I've sort of been the lead person advising our college on how to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We've done that to 60% down since 2008. And so if people have questions, I'll do my best to try to answer them. Another option is you can purchase something called renewable energy certificates. And one of my philosopher colleagues likes to tease me and call these indulgences. But what you're doing in this case is you buy in your electricity from where it comes from, because that's the only place you can get it. But you're paying somebody somewhere else, but not necessarily right there through Great Lakes Energy, to put renewable electricity into the grid. You're essentially incentivizing somebody else to put renewable electricity into the grid rather than putting greenhouse gas emission producing electricity into the grid. These are not particularly, to put solar panels on your house or to buy panels for the Great Lakes system, there's some cost to that. There's some cost to this, but not much cost. When I first bought them, when it was first possible in Texas, I wondered, would my electricity bill triple? And it went up by like $5 a month. It wasn't even noticeable. And if you conserve electricity here and there, you can probably make more difference than the cost of buying renewable energy certificates. They're called renewable energy certificates. That's somewhat confusing. They're really only used for renewable electricity. So people don't buy renewable energy certificates to make up for their gasoline consumption, for example. Anything like this, though, basically there's a piece of paper or some pixels on a computer file somewhere that says you paid for some renewable energy to go into the grid, and that's obviously could be scammed. You want it to be third-party certified, and I've been responsible for choosing my college's source of these things for a long time now. Anybody that says they're wind powered, if they don't have their own wind turbine and a wire coming from that to where they're plugging in their devices, this is how they're wind powered. And we always go with what's called Greenie certified renewable energy credits. And this is the Greenie web. They don't sell them. They just certify them. So that's another option if you would like to make the powering of your home or any other electricity you use so-called carbon neutral. But what about the emissions, again, that are not from electricity? In other words, you drove a gas-powered car, you bought a water bottle, who knows how it was made, and you try to, you're responsible for some greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, you're not the only one responsible, but if you hadn't bought the thing or driven the car, they wouldn't have been produced. What do you do about those? And the only way I know of that an individual can affect that is to purchase something called carbon offsets. And these are a little more nebulous, to say the least, than renewable energy certificates. And there have been, and early carbon offset efforts were unreliable, not necessarily fraudulent, but didn't always work out. And people sometimes see that and think, well, this is just a joke, you know, they dismiss it out of hand. I don't see it that way. I see it as a lot of things didn't work out so well when they were first being tried, like medicine, right? My wife's happens to be a family doctor. Her license is from she was trained in Toronto, and Texas wouldn't give her a license until she sent them the actual physical diploma. Well, why is that? Well, that's because people were selling all kinds of nonsense as medicine in the past, and it probably, you know, good chance it's worse for you than if you didn't take it in the first place. And so we learn, hey, we're going to actually have to regulate this stuff so it's legit. Or if you know anybody who's an accountant the tip of the Mitt indeed has to file IRS Form 990. I've been on enough boards to know about these things. With the IRS to show this is our financial statements. We're not just going to believe everybody's financial statements. So it's quite normal that mechanisms need to be in place to make sure nobody's scamming the system. And that's just getting developed now. But a physics colleague and I recently at college here just first started purchasing carbon offsets. We basically got our emissions down as much as we could. Hopefully we'll make more progress, but we made a lot of progress and it gets harder to make more progress. And so what are we going to do? Because we want to get to carbon neutrality, and it's going to cost 23 cents a day per person on campus to be carbon neutral. It's not going to cost $1 billion. But we need to buy carbon offsets. And so he and I have done a lot of analysis of where you can get legit carbon offsets. So, but the kinds of things you may hear about as carbon offsets is somebody plants trees and the trees suck up carbon and you give off carbon by your activities. And so you plant enough trees, it makes up for it. That's an option. There are people who are very enthusiastic about capturing greenhouse gases, stuffing them underground. And I won't say much about it because I'll try to be as neutral as I can, but that's an option. Two that I'm going to talk about a little bit, really just one, but there are two that I'm quite familiar with are plugging abandoned oil and gas wells that leak methane. Methane is the main component of natural gas. It's useful for heating. It's very strong greenhouse gas. If it escapes in the atmosphere without being burned, it's much, much worse than carbon dioxide, several times, like 60 times, I think is the main estimate. Or you could, some of you are probably aware that refrigerants have been changed initially to prevent stratospheric ozone depletion. That was important. There was no life on land until the stratospheric ozone layer developed. But those refrigerants, stratospheric ozone depletion doesn't cause greenhouse warming to much extent, but the same chemicals that cause stratospheric ozone depletion are very strong greenhouse gases while they're in the atmosphere. And there are old refrigerants out there. I mean, you know, in some refrigerator that somebody abandoned, literally. And there's a company that will find those, suck out those refrigerants and chemically transform them so that they're not greenhouse gases anymore. But they have nothing to sell except that they've done that. And that greenhouse gas won't get into it doesn't even exist anymore, so it can't get in the atmosphere. So here's, just to go into this a little bit more, here's a case of an orphan gas well. You may have seen this kind of thing in a lot of oil wells. They're getting oil and natural gas, but in many cases, the natural gas isn't there are no pipelines. They can put the oil in a tank, run it as a liquid through a pipe, but there aren't natural gas pipelines. They just burn it off. But if that flame wasn't lit, the methane would still be coming out, but it wouldn't. The flame is converting the methane into carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, but again, only like a 60th as bad as the methane. But without the flame, it's just coming out. And so there are oil and gas wells all over the place that have been abandoned and haven't been sealed properly to prevent methane coming out. Because what are they? I'm no oil and gas technology specialist, but they're, you know, to be a little cartoonish about it, they're a straw stuck down into the ground where it hit a reservoir where there was some oil and or gas, and then people sucked out some of it, and then they quit doing it and went away. And if they're very responsible, they made sure it was fully sealed off. But it's like I work on a prairie restoration at a little site where it was a family farm, and they, there might have been oil, and a couple of oil and gas wells got drilled, and I've met the nephew of the folks a long time ago, and they didn't hit any oil, but if they had, they might have gotten some oil out of it. At some point, it's not producing enough anymore, and there would be some expense to closing it down. And if you're not even aware of the problem, you just leave it there, and there it's leaking methane. And so the place that one of the types of carbon offsets that are sold by the place that my colleague and I have just recommended in the colleges is purchase them from, goes and finds abandoned oil and gas wells that nobody's taking responsibility for. The government doesn't have a big program to do this, and seals them off. If you are interested in carbon offsets, there are 4 criteria that you want to make sure to try to be as certain as you can that you've actually accomplished something by buying the carbon offsets. One is that they can measure the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that their process is responsible for. The second thing is it's permanent, and this is going to be a little depressing, but that's tricky with trees because the trees might have a forest fire. It doesn't mean wouldn't do any that are tree-based, but that's just something to keep in mind. The third is that, and this is jargon in the field, that they're additional. And what that means is that the activity that prevented the greenhouse gas emissions would not have occurred if somebody didn't buy carbon offsets. There's the people destroying refrigerants or plugging these wells, they have nothing to sell with the carbon offset. So they can't afford to be in business unless somebody's buying the carbon offset. So those are very additional. And it still has to be third-party certified. So if Pete Schulze tries to offer you some carbon offsets and doesn't have some third party, essentially an auditor going, yep, we think those are legit, checking the books, going and inspecting the site, et cetera, et cetera. It's like if I tell you I'm selling you organic eggs, but nobody has checked to make sure they're organic eggs. They might be organic eggs, they might not. Anyhow, those are those are some ways that you can affect your greenhouse gas emissions, net greenhouse gas emissions, if you'd like to do so. If you want to buy carbon offsets, you probably want to figure out how much carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are you responsible for. And here are some different websites that will ask you questions like how much do you drive, how many airplane flights, how do you heat your house and stuff. And you can get a pretty reasonable estimate that way. And here are a couple of companies. Again, I'd have no financial interest in this. I bought them from Native Energy for a long time for my family. Tradewater is a company that my colleague and I just recommended to the college, and the college I work for has just bought some offsets from. How are we doing on time?
You've got maybe 5 more minutes before we go to questions.
Good. Okay. I don't know the best way to help. If you're interested in talking about this, I've heard a prominent person trying to get the society to move on climate change say the best thing you can do is talk to other people and help them understand. I may very well be wrong. I could be wrong about pretty much everything, but I don't know anything that seems to get people's attention more than when I say a few degrees between over the 10,000 years ago and the ice was a mile thick. Folks just don't imagine that. And that might get some of your friends' attention. And if it does, then you can kind of go from there. When it comes to society, it can seem like we're not making any progress. In fact, everything's going the wrong way. But these are 2 images that I got permission to use in my book. I'd like to thank Popular Science magazine. They were willing to let me use this in what now is an embarrassing diagram from an article published in 1963, that the article, which was titled The Modern Garage. And if you had a modern garage, then the way you were supposed to maintain your vehicle, obviously you change the oil, and the proper way in Popular Science magazine in 1963 was dig a hole with a post hole digger, put gravel in there, pour the oil in, put some dirt over it, and it'll be absorbed by the time you need to change oil again. Of course, everybody on this call is thinking, yeah, it'll be absorbed by the groundwater. But I was alive in 1963, and that was the recommended proper way to do this. I also found this in a book years ago, and this was published in a government document in 1962, encouraging that this no longer happen. City dump at water's edge. Why? so we can bulldoze that stuff into the river. I don't believe that goes on. I don't think the tip of the Mitt recommends that behavior anymore. The point is, I hope when you see these things, you go, oh my. Well, it hasn't really been that long since then. And so it remains to be seen what decisions people make going forward. And so this is what has happened since those diagrams. Both of those things were about then. This is a graph from my book, shows how many environmental laws were passed per year. And I'm not just saying the more laws, the better. Life isn't that simple, but a bunch of the strong environmental laws that stopped the rivers in Detroit and the rivers in Buffalo and the Cleveland and the Houston from catching fire and made the air not sting your eyes anymore were passed during this period. And I've got it displayed this way to show these were bipartisan support. It doesn't mean every one of these individuals was a raging environmentalist, but there was bipartisan support for these things. They're passed, but you know, and to my students who barely remember this, you know, they probably don't, but they were probably alive. They're like, yeah, you know, the grown-ups haven't done anything. They don't live in the tip of the Mitt, and can't volunteer for the tip of the Mitt. So what happened? Well, three things happened that caused these bars to drop down. I mean, first thing is you don't need once you've got a law for one thing, you don't need another law for it necessarily. But one is the problems that we're thinking about now, like climate change, are less obvious than the air stinging your eyes or the rivers on fire that people were dealing with back then. Second is, frankly, the cost of implementation became apparent. If you want to consider eliminating your greenhouse gas emissions, it's not going to be free. If you with solar panels, you may save money in the long run, that sort of thing, but there's at least going to be some significant upfront cost. And the third thing is these things got passed when there wasn't really any effective resistance to passing them, but the resistance got organized, and it's far easier in our system, and it probably should be easier. It's far easier in our system to block a law than pass a law. Nobody wants to be told what to do, right? And so when we tell each other what to do, has to be pretty high bar that we're in agreement. Yeah, we really don't want to do that kind of stuff. It's very much easier to block a law than pass a law. So, for example, lots of times people have tried to pass a climate change law. It just hasn't happened. If you want to look at that graph and see what laws I use for this diagram, that's a QR code, but I don't consider that very convenient to use when I'm on a laptop. But so I think there'll be a link to my book and there'll be a QR code again in the last slide, but there'll be a link in the chat. So I wrote this, it's just some guy, it's just me, so don't get too excited. But I put in the last chapter of this book, we still send burned fossil fuel into the atmosphere, but that causes angst today and before long may be considered as ghastly as pouring oil on the ground or dumping at the water's edge. It might. If you just go from Tuesday to Wednesday, it might not seem like that change is happening, but it might. And so here's what I like to imagine. What's this graph? This is time. Here we are now. This is when the Industrial Revolution began. I just made this up, okay? This is relative damage to the environment. That would be negative, like the dark circles below zero, or repair of the environment. And if we go back here, there's a good deal of damage to the environment before the Industrial Revolution. This is amount per year. That's a rate. And then it starts getting worse with the Industrial Revolution and the population increasing and things. And there's not a lot of repairing the environment. That's pretty much a new thing. And then we get up around here and, well, there's still quite a lot of damage to the environment per year. This is repair, and this is what tip of the Mitt does. And then what's going to happen in the future? Well, this can go up fast, and this could hypothetically quit getting worse, and actually we could learn to not make as much damage. And once this magnitude is greater than this magnitude, then the cumulative damage, instead of adding up and up, starts getting less and less. It would never be zero because we're not going to get passenger pigeons back or dodo birds, but it would be less. And so I think this is possible, and it remains to be seen. It's based on, like Gandhi said, and it's quoted all the time, it depends on the decisions people make in the future. So that's where I was going to stop. This is a link to that book. If you're interested, it's free. I didn't want to tell my students they had to buy a book I wrote. And that's not really what we've talked about today, those obstacles, but it's there if you'd like to take a look. Thank you very much.
Dr. Schulze, that was really thought-provoking. Really, really thought provoking. I know there are a lot of questions in the chat. Heather's going to moderate those with you, so I'll turn it over to Heather before, and when you're done, I'll close this out. But I just wanted to say thank you. It was really
My
eye-opening.
pleasure. I look forward to trying to answer questions.
Yeah, good luck.
Thanks.
And I'm trying to sort of go through them and group them as best I can, maybe.
I
So
understand. I have my students have to have questions on the reading every day, and then we have to
yeah.
and
Yeah,
used to
so
that problem.
obviously lots of questions, lots of interest in carbon offsets and those sorts of things. But first, we do have a question about whether or not you're aware of any lake level chart that's historical, right? That for Lakes Michigan and Huron that might go back before pre-industrial revolution. You know, we know
Ooh,
that NOAA started tracking things in just before 1920. Was there any sort of
no,
modeling that's
I'm
done
not
for
aware
before
of.
that?
I'm not aware of things. I think that I don't. I'm looking at my bookshelf. I used to have a very interesting book on the environmental history of Michigan. I think it might be at home, and it's a long time since I looked at it. I would assume, I mean, it's not that easy to measure the lake level. If I don't know how you would do it without some pretty sophisticated technology.
Yeah.
But there could be historical accounts of that somebody happened to write down. But my guess is, and there may be models of what the lake level must have been. Certainly, if you look at back through ice ages, you can see,
Mhm.
that sort of thing, and the lake isn't even where it was or where it is. But I'm not aware of any,
Yeah, they're different
and
bodies
I
of
kind
water
of doubt
altogether,
there are
right?
any.
So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I personally thought it was really interesting just to be reminded that at and your point of we can't really sort of think about what to do before we actually understand kind of where we are, right? And really kind of get our brains around what is that 3 degrees or 4 degrees that we keep talking about, or that Bill McKibben has told us we're past that threshold anyway already, right? Um, so I just thought I would say that I was interesting to think about number one and be reminded that number one, we still are an agricultural society, um, despite what our current perceptions might be, right? And where
Mhm.
people live. Um, and and that then also, that 4 degrees colder ice was over a mile thick here. I think that's probably one of the best ways that I've been shown to kind of conceptualize these changes, right? So we also have some general sort of thoughts or thinking, maybe perspective from you on again how to reframe it from sort of being scared to educated, concerned, and taking action.
Mhm.
Um, and this person just kind of comments that we need to not ignore things and be looking for solutions and actions. Um, so a lot of questions also about what have you or maybe your students or other folks that help us think about the next 100 years. What do we do about, even though, like I said, even though we are still considered an agricultural society, we are seeing a loss of those lands, an abandonment of those lands, and a conversion of those lands, right, to other uses. And we've also had decades and decades of taking nutrients out of those agricultural lands and not replacing them. So
Mhm.
just kind of thinking about those deficits and what
Mhm.
kind of things might we be able to do to make up for those in the near-ish future.
Okay, yeah. So many things. So I would say um, it's important to remember that all is not lost. Okay, I have very little patience for these. We have 10 years to fix this kind of things. It doesn't mean it's not urgent. And my book has a chapter on why these things get put back burnered and we think they're not because they don't seem that urgent, but it's not that the situation isn't urgent, but it's not the first time people have had a problem to deal with. That I think into putting this in my office, and since with the background zoomed, that grandfather of mine, he had the pleasure of being in 2 world wars. He wasn't really in the first one, but he did make 205 training flights, and then the war ended. But that's head sticking out of the plane training flights. And then he was in the second war, as was my dad, as was my father-in-law. I have never done anything like remotely as hard as that, right? The college has saved money cutting its greenhouse gas emissions. We save about $500,000 a year because if you don't burn as much electricity and natural gas, you don't have to pay for as much. I'm with Theodore Roosevelt. Do what you can with what you have where you are. We don't have any choice. There is no planet B. If people want to hear me a little snarkier because it's the nature of the format, I gave a TEDx talk and it's called "We're Not Going to Mars," and then that may come back to haunt me. But anyway, somebody might go to Mars sometime. I'm fine with space exploration, but we can't just take 8 billion people and put them on Mars, and Mars is a disaster anyway. So we have no choice. This is a matter of there is no choice. You can give up or you can make an effort. I mean, I don't mean to sound sappy, but I mean, that's all there is to it. But meanwhile, we have people that are stressed out of their minds over finances and, being in debt and all this kind of stuff. And I teach evolutionary biology and I teach environmental studies. And 2 of the benefits that I did not realize I was going to get from that is if you teach evolutionary biology, you're not that surprised if you can't think clearly for a minute or something. Cause it's like, hey, I don't mean to mess with anybody's worldviews, but it's just the product of natural selection acting on some biochemistry. How was it going to work in a weird situation? And B, if you understand environmental things, then you understand the environmental benefit of not buying something, and that makes it easier to not get suckered in by marketing. I actually think the things that needs to happen is people need to get better at not getting fooled. I kind of think that the future depends on the ratio of how many people get fooled to not get fooled regularly. And frankly, if you've ever bought something and you thought, I wish I didn't spend the money on that. Yeah, if you didn't, you not only would have the money, you wouldn't have made the environmental impact. And so it's not going to be easy to get there, but I actually think people's lives can be improved by getting to a sustainable situation. If you're not familiar with the book called A Sand County Almanac, I expect many listeners are, by Aldo Leopold, he explains human society as having the ethical history of human society as ethical considerations being expanded to more and more realms than they previously were. And he says in his most famous essay called The Land Ethic that it's an ecological necessity and a sort of a possibility to expand ethical considerations of the environment. And I'm sure many people listening right now have been thinking ethically about the environment, for decades. It's not, and if you decide something is not okay, you don't do it, and it's not a big sacrifice anymore. It's just I wouldn't do that, and if that leads you to have less environmental impact and at the same time causes you to have less financial stress, then all kinds of possibilities emerge. I'm not trying to be sanguine or make it sound like this is easy. Meanwhile, with regard to the agricultural land, I mean, if they made me king, no organic material would go down a drain. No organic material would go into a septic system. No organic material would go to a wastewater treatment plant. And it certainly wouldn't go to a landfill. It would get composted and it'd go back on that land and it would start improving that land. To give you an anecdote, and I don't mean to take all the time on one question, but that was kind of a big question.
No, I think it's a big question and it's hitting a lot of other questions that folks had too.
We have a schedule here, which sort of sounds gimmicky, but we have spring semester, fall semester, and January term. And in January term, I teach prairie restoration. And prairies are, ecosystems that you can restore them in your lifetime to some extent. I don't mean fully. But they're not tropical forests where the tree has to live several hundred years to get full size, for example. But I get students, I have the class permission the instructor, and I try to talk every single student out of signing up. And I say, let me tell you what we're going to do. I grew up north. It's never going to seem too cold to me. Unless the roads are icy, we're going. You're going to get poked by every tree down here is thorny practically. You're going to get stabbed by thorny trees. You're going to get muddy. You're going to smell like fires that we set. You're going to do whatever physical work we need to do. And there's a whole class where you got to do all the reading and be ready for class every day too. And it fills every year, and they love doing it. It's not because of me. It's because they feel like they're doing something good, I think.
Yeah.
And I make it clear not even sure that what we're doing is going to work, but you got to try. And so it's easy to get despondent about it. But literally, when I was in college, I went to college across the lake, Lawrence University, and I was a great school. And I was studying ecology, and I was told then, this was in the late 1970s, do not get into anything with any kind of applied, easy to explain to the person on the street why you would study that. That is a career killer. I mean, that was abdication of responsibility by the field of ecology back then. I'm not blaming my professor. That was standard advice. That is not true now, right? So these things weren't on the radar as a systemic problem that needed to be solved for very long. 100 years ago, work deaths from, dangers at work were like 95% higher. Infant mortality was ghastly 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And those things were focused on. You were pretty sure, the chance of dying from an infectious disease, okay, it's been back a little bit lately, and I don't want to cause anybody to think about that if it's affected them personally, but those were the focus, and those things are better now. That doesn't mean everything's going to be fine or everything's hunky-dory or anything like that, but it's not out of the question that things work out. But it ain't going to happen by chance or by just hope it happens. You got to actually do something.
Yeah, I like the your comment. I want to call attention to our friend and colleague Lindsay Walker is on this webinar, and she is graciously sharing a lot of information, which I know has also been shared in the chat, about the city of Petoskey and its own. So city of Petoskey is its own utility, and they have they offer a volunteer renewable energy buy-in.
Awesome.
Both for business customers and for residential customers. But then she also, she is our recycling guru here in town. We love her. Recycling, composting, all those things, because you mentioned the Emmett County. Yeah, award winning. So anyway, she's got some comments, and maybe I'll ask Kala to copy those into the chat as well. Just about people might want to visit and learn more about. In Michigan, we have the My Healthy Climate Plan, and Lindsay pulls out goal number 5 specifically is about decarbonization of industry. And that we can hit that if we remove just 50% of the wasted food, right, that we put into landfills. So making some simple choices in your own household can really have, those sort of landscape scale effects that we were worried about, but we can really do something. Just a couple other quick sort of detail questions. Peter, we had some questions about whether, I think you answered the question about companies that certify carbon credits that you think are trustworthy. So thank you for sharing those that Austin College has purchased from. But the other question was about, are there any tax incentives for renewable energy credits that you know of? Oh, there are. Okay.
Let me correct that. I'm not aware of tax incentives for renewable energy credits. There are federal tax incentives, and I don't know how this will go in the short term in the future, but there are tax incentives for putting in solar panels.
Oh, right.
Kind of
yes.
thing. People are probably aware of that. I'm not aware of them for renewable energy credits. Most renewable energy credits get bought by utilities that are not generating renewable energy, but for which their state has a requirement that a fraction of the utility's energy has to be renewable or it was initially focused on renewable, I think, more than greenhouse gas avoiding. But you can also buy them yourself if you're a sucker like I am, but literally, I mean, for the college, the whole college, this is not a big college. It's like Alma or size, or, you know, it's a typical liberal arts college size, maybe a little bigger than Alma, I'm not sure. We've never spent more than $20,000 a year extra on a net utility budget of 1.5 million a year to make our electricity wind powered. And what we're essentially doing is buying electricity and renewable energy credits, because you can't make an electron come in from a windmill and then travel through and bypass everything else and go to your laptop. It's coming in someplace and you're taking another electron out someplace else. And you don't want to have multiple sets of wires. That would be crazy. So when you say you're buying wind power, I mean, we looked at the college having its own turbine, but then that doesn't make sense. You need to have it for economies of scale reasons, and it's not, you need to put them in the right spots and things. But so anybody that says they're buying wind power or buying solar power, this is essentially how it's working.
Sure.
But I'm not aware of any tax credits for buying renewable credits.
Okay.
I
think
would say, let me emphasize though, they're not expensive.
Sure. Right. I think that hits most of the questions, and I apologize to folks if it feels like we didn't answer your question. We can certainly, you know, work more on that and reach out to us to get more information if you need that. But we are at 106, so.
If people are welcome to contact me if they'd like to. I'm not too hard to find.
Thank you again for your time. Really incredible information. I feel like we have to have you back for part 2 at some point. And I thank you for bringing up Lindsay, because I was seeing Lindsay's Walker's comments popping up. I know she was probably wanted to hop on screen herself and talk about some of the amazing things that Emmett County Recycling was doing. So Lindsay, if you're still on, I'll give you a call too. Maybe we can have you out to talk to our people with another lecture about some things that you guys are doing locally, because it's really amazing. So thanks, Lindsay.
Y'all really are. You're gonna get copied in the long run, you know. So if you have a long day at work or whatever, you didn't get 130 volunteers, you got 110 one day. You're setting examples that believe me, there's other parts of the country that we'll learn from in the long run, hopefully in the sooner run.
Thank you. And thank you again. So just to close us out, I'm just going to share a little bit of information on our upcoming activities. Let's see. Okay, so our upcoming Linking Lakes event is coming up this summer. Registration for that will begin in April. That'll be held at North Central Michigan College this year. Just a reminder, we are still offering the Green Belt Cost Share Program in the Burt Lake Watershed, where we will cover up to half of the cost of installing a green belt on your waterfront property. Sorry, my little Turner's not working. We are hosting a real estate professionals focus group on May 5th from 10 to 11. This is held virtually on Zoom. We're seeking input from local realtors about what information waterfront homeowners are looking for from you. And of course, we're always in need of volunteers. If you've ever been interested in becoming a water quality monitor, please reach out to us. We have limitless volunteer opportunities here at the Watershed Council. And of course, nothing we do is possible without our members and donors. So please consider joining us as a member of the Watershed Council and helping us to continue our work here locally in Northern Michigan. So thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Schulze. Look forward to following up with you after this with some of the feedback and really digesting the information you gave today. So thank you. Okay.